This little sign, as I speak tonight, is posted publicly in front of a house on a quiet street in Brooklyn, New York. It says, quote, 377 Union Street, the house that brought down a president. 377 Union Street will forever be known as the building that led to the collapse of the presidency of Donald J. Trump. Originally acquired by Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort in January 2017, this building's finances would later become the foundation for initial charges of money laundering and conspiracy against the United States of America. Under the direction of special counsel Robert Mueller, these central criminal indictments were the tip of the iceberg in the federal investigation of collusion, conspiracy, and other illegal activities by Donald J. Trump and his associates. Thought to be originally built around 1899, 377 Union Street is constructed 22 feet by 45 feet on a 90-foot lot in the classic brownstone style of the Carroll Gardens area. Signed, New York Landmark Preservation Foundation. I should say the brownstone in the classic brownstone style, the house is real, it exists. That sign is not a real landmark. It's a three-dimensional, very pointed joke. But tonight, the president's campaign chairman is spending his first night in jail somewhere in Washington, D.C. And yes, the charges against him are in part about real estate, including the finances that led to the purchase of that brownstone, and alleged money laundering and tax evasion and all the rest. Now that he's in jail, though, the next obvious question is that what prosecutors would want to talk to him about if he would talk to them instead of continuing to fight this thing? How much is this incredible pressure now, the jailing of Paul Manafort, about the big picture Russia case? And as Paul Manafort continues not to cooperate and to fight these charges against him, up to and including enduring jail tonight, what are his actual chances of being acquitted, of fighting this and winning? Joining us now is Devlin Barrett, national security reporter with the Washington Post. Mr. Barrett, thank you for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Sure.
When I look at what we know about Paul Manafort and the charges against him and what's in public reporting about what he's been up to, I have lots of questions about whether or not these multiple indictments of Manafort, the incredible pressure that he's under now, particularly now that he's in jail, whether it is directly related to the Russia case, or whether this is really about him and his financial malfeasance. How do we know?
Well, so first of all, you have to remember the Manafort investigation was sort of a legacy inheritance from the FBI and the Justice Department, who had been looking at Manafort's financial conduct for a long time before Mueller showed up on the scene. But it was very quickly decided when Mueller was appointed that he would inherit that investigation. So these two things are very much connected, and I don't think it's worth a ton of time trying to separate them out so much, other than to say, as you point out, the financial charges against him and the degree to which he may or may not be convicted and obviously now that he's in jail, is a tremendous pressure point on Manafort to cooperate with Mueller on the bigger questions of possible conspiracy with Russians.
Everybody thinks that Paul Manafort is being pressured by prosecutors to cooperate with them, to alleviate that pressure on himself, and we all assume that pressure from prosecutors is because Paul Manafort does have important information to give them about the larger case that these prosecutors are pursuing. An alternate theory of the case here is that Paul Manafort thinks he is not guilty of any of these things that he is charged with. He can endure discomfort and legal bills right now because ultimately he's going to be vindicated. He's going to be acquitted, and there's no reason for him to plead to anything he didn't do. How strong is the case against him?
The case is pretty strong against him for two reasons. One, a lot of this is paper, right? So this is about tax filings. This is about documents from banks. So that's one thing. Two, some of the most important witnesses against him, as far as we can tell from what we know at this point, some of the most important witnesses against him are, for example, his accountant, his lawyer. Those aren't great witnesses if you're trying to beat a case. And so I think those two factors together, the extensive paper case that prosecutors describe, the fact that some of Manafort's own service providers have given evidence against him, according to prosecutors, those are pretty tough things to overcome as a defendant. But look, you never really know for sure until you get in court with it.
Looking at the transcript of the hearing today, it was daunting, just reading it as a layman and seeing how good the prosecutors are at making their case. At least they were today in front of this judge. And again, I'm no pro. The other really striking thing that happened today, though, in addition to this hearing, is that the president publicly made a statement that this was, he called it a sentence. It's not a sentence, but he called this very unfair. And then the president's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, started publicly musing about how the president might clean this all up with pardons. Could a pardon be a get-out-of-jail-free, literally, card for Paul Manafort here? And is the president's lawyer, Mr. Giuliani, or potentially the president himself, in trouble for sort of publicly dangling that today? Is that something that you're not supposed to do?
It's something you're not supposed to do as a legal matter, and we saw the president. We saw the president's lawyer walk that statement back to us within hours. So I think, but look, you know, in intelligence terms, a dangle is a dangle, right? You throw the idea out there, and that's alarming, certainly to law enforcement officials. I think a pardon would be, you know, would be so politically damaging right now to the president that I think they understand the risks that even talking about it create. But look, somehow they keep talking about it, right? Rudy Giuliani is not the first of the president's lawyers to suggest this. This happened earlier. And so this keeps coming up. And I do think there's reason to be, at a minimum, very curious as to what the president really believes about whether or not he should pardon any of these people and when. So I do think it's a big deal.
Devlin Barrett, national security reporter with the Washington Post. Really appreciate you being here with us on a Friday night. Thanks, Devlin.
Sure.
Much appreciated. I should also mention on that pardon point, it does complicate both the politics and the legal approach that a president might take toward trying to sort of save himself from Paul Manafort's potential testimony by pardoning Paul Manafort. Mr. Manafort is charged alongside somebody who is believed to be a Russian intelligence agent. And unless the president's also going to pardon the Russian intelligence agent, this prosecution would presumably continue along the lines that it has been pursued thus far, even if Paul Manafort got that get-out-of-jail-free card. So you think the president's going to pardon the Russian guys too? Maybe. We'll be right back. 1,995. That is the number of kids the Department of Homeland Security says the U.S. government has separated from their parents at the southern border in the 6 weeks between April 19th and May 31st. That's 46 kids a day on average. Most of these families came to the U.S. from Central America, but they're from all over. Some of them are seeking asylum from gang violence or domestic violence. All of these kids have been forcibly taken away from their parents by the U.S. government now because of this new Trump administration policy that they're calling zero tolerance, announced in April. This is the policy to start taking kids away from their parents at the border, and then they're locking up the parents and also locking up the kids, but they're locking them up separately. This new policy from the Trump administration is jarring enough, but we now know as of today that it's also a very large-scale policy. 2,000 kids taken away from their parents and locked up already? The knock-on effect is that the Trump administration is scrambling to find somewhere to put all of these kids that they have taken from their mothers. And remember, this isn't like older teenagers who got caught crossing the border on their own, which is a whole different problem that the government has dealt with through lots of previous administrations. In this case, this is new. We're talking about toddlers and babies who have been taken out of their mother's arms by the government, and then the government has to figure out what to do with them. The Trump administration's latest solution for handling these kids that they've taken is that they're opening a tent city for kids they've taken at the port of entry in Tornillo, Texas. Tornillo is about 40 miles from El Paso. It's on the Mexican border. A reporter from the local NBC affiliate went there to see the setup.
If you take a look off in the distance, it might be difficult to tell with our camera, but off to the left of that brown building, you can see that large white tent. Our crews who were out here yesterday did receive confirmation that this is where the children were going to be temporarily housed.
It's just under 100 degrees in Tornillo today. But the Trump administration, this is not a proposal. They have picked that spot to hold 360 kids in tents outdoors. Some of them have reportedly already arrived and will be sleeping there as of tonight. And they will be there until they are released to a parent, a sponsor, who knows when. This is an emotional issue. This is something the U.S. government has never done before. Outrage has been building for weeks, but today, with the first new hard data about how many kids have been taken from their parents and locked up by the government, separate from their families, the anger is at this point dialed up to 1,995. Everybody keeps saying this is politically unsustainable, but we have no sense that the Trump administration plans on ending this anytime soon, and kids are getting to that tent city apparently tonight. Well done.
Thank you.
And thanks to At Home for joining us this hour. Lots of news to get to today. You knew this news week was going to be crazy. We sort of knew that Friday was going to be crazy. We didn't know it was going to be this crazy. And this historic. Today is the day in American history that the sitting president's campaign chairman was remanded into federal custody, put in jail. And we know exactly how that went because we just got the transcript. So let me tell you what happened here. There were 3 prosecutors from the special counsel's office, also an FBI agent working with Mueller's team. On the other side, there were 3 defense lawyers working for the president's campaign chair, Paul Manafort, and Paul Manafort himself was in the courtroom too. So they started with an arraignment. Paul Manafort, you might remember, was charged just a few days ago with new felony charges. An arraignment is where you stand up in court and face the charges against you and you say whether you are pleading guilty or not guilty. So that's what they did first, the arraignment. Courtroom deputy, are you Paul J. Manafort Jr.? Defendant Paul Manafort, I am. Courtroom deputy, are you the person named in the superseding indictment? Defendant Paul Manafort, I am. Courtroom deputy, Mr. Manafort, you are charged in criminal case number 17-201-1 in a 7-count superseding indictment, charging you with the following. Count number 1, conspiracy against the United States. Count number 2, conspiracy to launder money. Count number 3, acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign principal. Count number 4, false and misleading statements concerning the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Count number 5, false statements. Count number 6, obstruction of justice. And count number 7, conspiracy to obstruct justice. Courtroom deputy continues, do you waive formal reading of the superseding indictment? Defendant Paul Manafort says, I do. Paul Manafort's attorney, Kevin Downing, says, we do. And then the judge says, for the purposes of the arraignment, how do you plead to the superseding indictment? Defendant Paul Manafort says, not guilty, to which the judge says, all right. So that's the start. This superseding indictment he just pled not guilty to, that's the new indictment where the president's campaign chairman is charged in part in a joint indictment with a Russian guy, a Russian citizen who the special counsel said today in court is in Russia now, and who the special counsel has said previously is believed to be actively linked to a Russian intelligence agency. So Paul Manafort, in this superseding indictment, the last 2 counts of this indictment, he's charged jointly with a Russian guy linked to Russian intelligence. Now, the Russian intel guy Manafort is charged with in this superseding indictment, the Russian guy did not turn up in court for his arraignment on these charges today, along with Paul Manafort, but we will have more on that in a moment. Now, what happened next was more dramatic. First, we got him pleading not guilty to the new charges that he's facing, along with his Russian co-defendant, who's not there in court. And then we get the part that leads to him going to jail. You'll recall that Paul Manafort was first charged last October, then he was further charged in February, then he was further charged last week. But what happened today, after he was arraigned on the newest set of charges today, the ones where he pled not guilty, what happened right after that was that then the judge took up the issue at length of whether or not Manafort could continue to be out on house arrest while he's waiting for his trial to start. The latest charges from the special counsel's office say that Manafort secretly contacted witnesses in his case and tried to get those witnesses to lie for his benefit. And he made those contacts while he's out on bail on these other charges. That's witness tampering, according to prosecutors. They brought these charges against Paul Manafort, letting the judge know that, in their estimation, he's been tampering with witnesses, and therefore they should reconsider the fact that, or the judge should reconsider the fact that he's been out on bail. So the judge today had to decide, given these new serious witness tampering charges, if Paul Manafort could still stay out on bail or whether she needed to revoke his bail and instead put him in jail for the time between now and when his trial starts. And as you know, the judge ultimately did decide that she needed to put Paul Manafort in jail. And that jailing means of course, there's an amazing amount of new pressure on the president's campaign chairman, who tonight, as I speak, sits in jail for the first night. But because we got this transcript, we also have a unique window into what the pressure is like on him already, what the pressure has been like on him in the courtroom. I don't know if there's any other way to get, if you couldn't be in the courtroom, since there's no cameras in the courtroom, I don't know if there's any other way to get a sense of what happened here other than by getting it from this transcript. But check this out. What's happening here is Manafort's defense team is trying to argue that when Paul Manafort, in fact, admittedly, called and texted these people about his case, he couldn't have been tampering with witnesses. They basically tried to contend today that he was just reaching out to people he knew. These people he was reaching out to talk to them about his case, he didn't know they were witnesses in his case. So here's where Manafort's defense lawyers make that case to the judge. The judge considers it, and then she gives the prosecutor from Robert Mueller's office a chance to respond, and the Mueller's office prosecutor just destroys the case they were making. All right, here we go. Richard Wessling, who's one of Manafort's defense lawyers, he says, I think the difficulty here, Your Honor, is that this is a broad-ranging matter that is largely something the government continues to expand. And with that, it puts Mr. Manafort in a position of not knowing whether any call he makes is a risk of violating the unknown list of witnesses in a situation where that's not made clear. And so from my perspective, a clear no contact rule will solve the problem. I think if we simply cut off that line of contact, it will solve the problem. We're trying in an appropriate way for the court to weigh the balance it is forced to weigh, where there's a general sense that where there are conditions, remaining out of jail pending a trial is the proper result. And I know that, you know, these are the kind of things that judges wish they didn't have to deal with. And the judge says, yes. And the defense lawyer says, we all get that. And then the judge says, this has been, it continues to be, to this minute, an extraordinarily difficult decision. And Manafort's defense lawyer says, I understand that. But I believe that Mr. Manafort can be put in a position, Your Honor, where conditions can be set, meaning conditions of his release, conditions of his bail. I think that Manafort can be put in a position, Your Honor, where conditions can be set. And I think that's largely a no contact rule that's clear and unambiguous from this court. Then this will not happen again. And the goal of what the court does here today is all about preventing it from happening again. If we jump to the thought that that means he should be remanded, meaning jailed today, that may achieve the result, but it will do so in a manner that is more harsh and creates more challenges for this defendant as he faces 2 trials in separate courts and preparing for those trials. It would be more harsh and create more challenges for this defendant than the Bail Reform Act requires or compels under these circumstances. To which the judge says, all right, thank you. And then she turns to the prosecution, turns to the special counsel's office, and she says, you have the burden, Mr. Andres. So I'll let you, since you're already standing. So the prosecutor from the special counsel's office is already standing at this point. It's Greg Andrus, who's the prosecutor. And he jumps in and he says this. My colleague, meaning defense counsel, who I'm arguing against here, my colleague has the law absolutely wrong with respect to witness tampering. Absolutely wrong. A defendant can be involved in witness tampering without a list of government witnesses, right? It's any person who may give testimony. With the Habsburg group, which is the issue that Mr. Manafort is reaching out to persons D1 and D2 about, persons D1 and D2, they controlled the Habsburg group. It's inconceivable that he doesn't know that they're potential witnesses. And that's what the law is. Not that they've been told that there's a witness. It isn't about a no contact list. This is about influencing the testimony of a potential witness, a crime for which Mr. Manafort has now been indicted. He has absolutely violated the terms of his bail by committing a crime while on bail. That's one. 2, he has the law absolutely wrong about threats of violence and witness tampering. When a defendant tells a witness a false story and reminds him of that story, the courts have held repeatedly that that constitutes witness tampering. So Mr. Wessling, the defense counsel, is wrong about what it means to be a witness. He is wrong about having to have a no contact list or a list of government witnesses. He is wrong about the type of methods that can be used to tamper with the witness. So says the special counsel's office prosecutor. And the judge found that, in fact, Mr. Wessling, the defense counsel, was having as bad a day as it seemed like he was having in that moment. The prosecutors then went on to say that Paul Manafort had contacted these witnesses using encrypted apps and using a technique called foldering, where he wrote emails, he'd save the emails in a draft folder and never send them, then he'd give somebody else the password to that email account so that other person could log into the email account and read that written draft that Paul Manafort had written without the email actually ever being sent or received. It's sort of a counter-surveillance trick. So the prosecutors explain that that's what Manafort has been doing to communicate. We didn't know that before this hearing today. But essentially, they're spelling out how Manafort has been trying to evade surveillance while he's been breaking the law and contacting witnesses while he's out on bail. Here's Greg Andrus, prosecutor from the special counsel's office. It's important to note as well, Judge, that this issue with the obstruction of justice, the government didn't learn about that by somehow subpoenaing or monitoring or getting a search warrant for Mr. Manafort's communications. We learned about it because a witness in this case, who was part of the government's investigation, brought forth the information about the tampering. And that's when we started our investigation. That's when we asked the court for additional time to give our opinion about bail, and that's where we started our investigation. So there's no way to monitor Mr. Manafort's communications in some effective way. The only condition that defense counsel suggests will address the issue of him, Mr. Manafort, tampering with witnesses is a no contact list. It's just not sufficient to protect the community or to give the court any confidence that Mr. Manafort will not try this again. It's not a single episode. It's a campaign that took place over 5 weeks. As we sit here today, Judge, Mr. Manafort has committed a crime while he's on bail. As we sit here today, Judge, Mr. Manafort is out on a $10 million recognizance bond, and he's been indicted for a crime while on bail. And the judge responds, "Thank you. I want to take some time to absorb it." And at that point, there's actually a little bit more arguing, more pleading from Manafort's defense counsel about the delicate balancing act that they say is needed here. The judge says, okay, takes a 15-minute recess. And then she comes back and she issues her ruling. And she explains why she's going to put the president's campaign chairman in jail. And this part of what happened today, this is the part that, like, it's going to make your kid who's watching this with you tonight, it's going to make your kid want to grow up to not be just a lawyer and to definitely not want to be a defendant. This is the part that's maybe going to make your kid want to be a judge. So if you don't want that, time to turn me off. All right, so the judge comes back from the 15-minute recess. And she says, quote, "The touchstone of the Bail Reform Act is still and always has been flight and safety," meaning risk of flight by the defendant so that they wouldn't have to go to trial. Flight and safety. The law is clear that I cannot impose pretrial detention to punish this defendant for the alleged conduct in the new allegations. And so I have struggled with this decision. Here, I don't believe there's been any change in the defendant's risk of flight. The additional charges don't really change the calculus that much, given what he was already facing. Is he a danger? While the grand jury has found probable cause to believe that the defendant, Mr. Manafort, has attempted to corruptly persuade people to lie, there's been no evidence of even a threat of harm to any person. We don't have what one would consider the typical sort of harm to the community at large. Dangerous substances being peddled on the corner, unlawful possession of firearms. The harm in this case is the harm to the administration of justice. It's the harm to the integrity of the court system. And the judge says, I've wrestled with this. What conditions could there be? This is not middle school. I can't take his cell phone. And if I say, well, don't call the 56 witnesses that defense counsel tells me I need to clearly list in this order, will Manafort call the 57th? All the defendant has said to me is, well, there wasn't a clear enough order saying not to do it. And my problem is, I don't think I can draft a clear enough order to cover every possible future violation of the United States Code. And I shouldn't have to. I thought about this long and hard, Mr. Manafort. I have no appetite for this, but in the end, I cannot turn a blind eye to these allegations. Given the number of contacts, the persistence of the contacts, and their obvious intent and import, it's how they were perceived and received by the person to whom they were made. And this witness tampering occurred while the defendant was already on bond and already under an order by another judge to not do this. The indictment alleges a corrupt attempt to undermine the integrity and truth of the fact-finding process upon which our system of justice depends. The defense suggested that it was inappropriate for the government to bring these matters to my attention. So I want to state quite clearly that it absolutely was not. You struck that note repeatedly in your papers, but this hearing is not about politics. It's not about the conduct of the Office of Special Counsel. It's about the defendant's alleged conduct. I'm very troubled that the contacts with these witnesses are alleged to have taken place even after you were under an explicit order not to contact witnesses directly or indirectly. I am concerned that you seem inclined to treat these proceedings as just another marketing exercise and not a criminal case brought by a duly appointed federal prosecutor in a federal court. All of this at bottom affects my judgment about whether you can be trusted to comply with the court's directives. That is the finding that the statute also requires me to make if I release you. And I can't make it. You have abused the trust placed in you 6 months ago, and therefore the government's motion will be granted, and the defendant will be detained pending trial as of today. Manafort's defense counsel, quote, "Your Honor, we would ask that the court stay imposition of any remand to allow us to appeal." The judge then turns to the prosecutors. What's the government's position on that? Greg Andrus, the prosecutor from the special counsel's office, says, "Judge, there are no conditions to address any of the concerns of the court. There are no conditions, as the court has found, to guard against the danger to the community. So we oppose that application." And then the judge says, "And I'm also concerned that now that I've issued this order, the risk of flight has just multiplied substantially. So," the judge says, "I appreciate the request for an appeal, and it's a serious request, and I understand that, but I'm going to deny it." And that's how it happened. And then the president's campaign chairman was taken away to jail. He waved to his wife. He was led out of the courtroom. A few moments after he was led out of the courtroom, a U.S. Marshal came back into the courtroom and handed Mrs. Manafort her husband's wallet and his belt and the very nice burgundy-colored tie that he was wearing. This week has been nuts, right? I mean, this week started with the President of the United States lavishing praise for hours on the dictator of North Korea, after driving a hard bargain in which the North Koreans got a summit with the US president, hours of praise for their dictator from him, a cessation of US and South Korean joint military exercises, the apparent promise from the president that economic sanctions could be dropped soon too. And they got all of those things in exchange for them doing nothing. That's how the week started. By the end of the week today, the Associated Press published news that the pace at which the Trump administration is ordering that children be torn away from their parents at the Mexican border, the pace of that new policy of the Trump administration is now running at nearly 50 kids a day. 50 times a day, an intact family is being forcibly separated by the US government, and the children are being taken away and locked up separately from their parents. Nearly 50 times a day. And also today, the president's campaign chairman indicted and arraigned on new felony charges that he engaged in obstruction of justice and a criminal conspiracy with a Russian citizen who's assessed by the FBI to have active ties to a Russian intelligence service. The president's campaign chairman today sent to jail, potentially for months, to await one of his 2 federal felony trials. Paul Manafort's Russian co-defendant has not entered a plea on these most recent felony charges that they both faced together, nor was he jailed alongside Paul Manafort today. That's because he's in Russia. where the Russian government will presumably continue to shield him from the special counsel's investigation and, like the other 13 Russian citizens who have been charged thus far with felonies in the Mueller investigation, the Russian government presumably will continue to prevent him from being extradited to a U.S. courtroom to face these charges alongside Manafort. So it's tempting to say this is a wild week in the news. It is certainly a wild time to be a living, sentient American citizen. But in some ways, it feels like the news right now is maybe more of a piece. At least a lot of it is. Susan Glasser at The New Yorker reports today that the president has now told his staff to start planning for what he wants to be his next summit, which he wants to be with Vladimir Putin. The president's unilateral concessions to the North Korean dictator earlier this week included a surprise gift that China and Russia both have been asking for months, and that we now know Putin personally lobbied Trump about months ago. When Trump announced in Singapore this week that he was going to halt joint U.S.-South Korean military exercises, that was reportedly a surprise to everybody else in the White House and to the U.S. military. The president just called an audible on that and announced it on his own. But we now know that Russia had been asking for it, that President Vladimir Putin had personally asked President Trump for that. President Trump this week granted that wish. This is a president who benefited from Russian interference in the election to try to help him win. A president who continued even today to rail against the investigation of that interference. A president who continues to help Russia out, even in ways that surprise the rest of the people who now work for him. And the jailing of his campaign chairman today is widely being described as having nothing to do with any of that. And in a literal letter of the law sense, that is maybe true. The Trump campaign chair is now jailed while awaiting trial on charges of money laundering, bank fraud, tax fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States, false statements, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the thing. Paul Manafort going to jail is the most dramatic sign yet that Mr. Manafort is not planning on cooperating with prosecutors no matter what they throw at him, no matter what they charge him with, no matter how hard they're going to make his life. And his life just got very, very, very much harder today. Being in jail tonight is no joke. But what is it that they want him to cooperate with them about? Paul Manafort was charged in a joint indictment alongside a longtime business associate who is believed to work for Russian intelligence and who is currently a fugitive from U.S. justice, being shielded from U.S. courts by the Russian government. Paul Manafort is known to have been in frequent, if not constant, communication with that alleged Russian intelligence operative throughout the time he was running the Donald Trump for President campaign. That Russian intelligence operative is the person through whom Paul Manafort reached out during the campaign to a Russian oligarch close to Vladimir Putin to offer that oligarch private briefings on the U.S. election while he was in charge of the Trump campaign. That same Russian oligarch alleges in multiple court filings that Paul Manafort owes him millions of dollars. The Associated Press reported last year that that same Russian oligarch signed Paul Manafort up to a $10 million a year contract to promote the interests of the Putin government. Paul Manafort's time running the Trump campaign came to an end when there started to be too many press reports about surreptitious payments he'd allegedly been receiving from pro-Putin political parties in Ukraine, in the former Soviet Union. Before he left the campaign, though, the time he spent running the Trump campaign coincided with the sharp rise in Russian government and intelligence activity to benefit Trump's campaign and help Trump win. And that's not even mentioning that CNN report last year that U.S. intelligence agencies collected intercepted communications among suspected Russian operatives where they were discussing amongst themselves their communications with Paul Manafort and how Paul Manafort had been encouraging whatever help he could get for the Trump campaign from Russia. So no, the Trump campaign chairman going to jail today technically has nothing to do with Russia, or the Trump campaign allegedly working with Russia on a foreign intelligence operation to swing our last election. That is not why Paul Manafort was jailed today. But that is presumably what prosecutors would like to talk to him about, if only he would talk to them. Why won't he? Is it because if he does talk, he's scared of who will come knocking on his door, and he's more scared of that than jail? Is it because he really thinks he's going to win his case? He's going to be acquitted on all charges. Is that possible? Hold on, more ahead.